Dear ladies and gentlemen, we are ready to kick off with the second panel of the discussion. And the panel will be called Prospects and Challenges of NATO's Enhanced Forward Presence in the Baltic states and Poland. And my name is Māris Andžāns. I'm representing both the Latvian Institute of International Affairs and also Riga Stradiņš University. And I will be the moderator for the second leg of the discussion. So, as the Baltic states regained the independence in the beginning of 90s, accession to NATO, it seemed something like a very distant dream. But it took not that much. So in 2004, the Baltic states were acceded to NATO. However, to be fair, in 2004, NATO was not the same NATO as many of us dreamed here. So NATO was not a typical collective defense alliance anymore at that point. And for quite objective reasons, the alliance did many tasks. But the collective defense probably wasn't on the top of the agenda of NATO. Also meaningful allied presence in the Baltic states was something like a taboo in the West. So boots on the ground, no, never, because that would provoke Russia and similar arguments. But of course, conflict in Ukraine, it changed everything. It changed not only the security threat landscape here in the Baltic Sea region, but it changed also NATO. And next Monday, the official ceremony will be held in Ādaži to inaugurate the enhanced forward presence. It definitely will not be the end of the history. Many questions remain. So we have to see, will it be a short-term solace to the allies here in the Baltic states or Poland, or maybe in a few years we will return to business as usual with Russia. So we have had already resets previously, so why not now? This is not what I'm proposing, but we have to be careful about the future. And is it possible that this presence can evolve in something like more permanent and extended presence here in the Baltic states and Poland? And also questions such, are the current numbers of troops enough? Is it enough to deter Russia from provocations and challenges? And if we believe Russia, this has exacerbated the regional security situation. And these are the questions that we will address today with our panelists, and we will have different positions. So we will have countries that are reassured, we will have countries that are reassuring, and we will have also representatives coming from a country against which we are reassured. So, and let me briefly introduce to the panelists of the discussion today. So first, from my left, we have Waldemar Ratajczak, who is Deputy Director of the International Security Policy Department at the Ministry of National Defense in Poland. And he has worked in the system of the MOD of Poland since the beginning of 90s, so it's very experienced in this sphere. He has also served as the military advisor to Polish missions in OSCE in Vienna and also UN office in Geneva. And I have to say that our Polish partners have been very, I would say, they have observed perfect continuity, because each year they send somebody with the surname Ratajczak. So last year it was Romuald Ratajczak, this year it's Waldemar Ratajczak. So welcome, Colonel. Next we have Kalev Stoicescu from Estonia. He is representing the International Center for Defense and Security based in Tallinn, and he is also a very experienced diplomat. And he has served the Estonian diplomatic service since the beginning of 90s, and he has been not only the ambassador to OSCE, but also to the United States and Canada. And then he has also been employed by the Ministry of Defense later, so very, very experienced diplomat, and now turned researcher. Next we have Mr. Jānis Kažociņš, who is well known here in Latvia. He was the boss of the Constitution Protection Bureau for some years in Latvia, and previously, if I may say so, in his previous life, he was also very had a very bright career in the British Armed Forces, and he retired at the rank of Brigadier General. And if I remember correctly, so Mr. Kažociņš served also on the front line at the western side of the Iron Curtain during the Cold War. So you have witnessed how it was then, how then the Soviet bloc was, let's say, deterred, and now you have the opportunity to observe how things develop here. So warm welcome. Next we have Christian Leuprecht, who comes from Canada. So, and Christian, he's a professor of political science at the Royal Military College of Canada, and he's also senior fellow of the Macdonald Laurier Institute. So also very, very rich background in publications and in speeches, and I have to admire him for coming here to Riga, because he arrived only after midnight and taxi is not yet there, but it soon will come. And as I understand, you spent more time in the air coming here to Riga than you are spending here in Riga. So indeed, much appreciated for coming down here to Riga. And last but not least, we have Albert Zulkharneev, who is the director of the Peer Center in Moscow, in Russia. So that all opinions are well represented, and the Peer Center, it's an independent NGO, so which is tasked not only with research, but also with educational issues and also public awareness raising. And it's interesting that he started, as I understand, as an intern in 2007, so in 2015 he was already director. So that is also a good example for our interns, which are assisting us today. So I understand they are listening and they see the perspective that there are some opportunities of career. So I will stop here, and we will have only, no, not in fact 1 hour, 20 minutes, only 1 hour, because the previous panel spoke, let's say, a bit more than they should have spoken. So therefore, without further delay, I would like to give the floor to each of the panelists, and I'll be very strict, 6-7 minutes, not a second more. So, and I would like to start with my left from Colonel Ratajczak with his introductory remarks.
Thank you very much first for inviting me and to the meeting. I'm honored to be here, and thank you for your words. I'd like to say one thing on the beginning. General Ratajczak, who was last year, he is not my relative. He's not family business in Poland. Just coincidence. Okay. And now coming to the topic, I think here there is no need to repeat that the strategic situation in Central Europe has changed during the last 3 years, and we need to respond in some way. It was a strong need. Russia, through its action against Ukraine, combined with the fully fledged modernization of its armed forces and unpredictability of its military activities, has emerged as a strategic challenge. Means which are used by Russia are broad and complex. And there is one more important factor that we should take into account. This is the blurred boundaries between peacetime, crisis, and conflict. This is especially in case of, with regard to hybrid model of operations, which we perceive in Poland as the element of Russian strategy. NATO, as I said, had to adapt to this new situation, and Newport and Warsaw summits, we not only made specific decisions in these regards, but we also accepted that we accepted it as our long-term objective. The key results of Warsaw Summit has been the strengthening of deterrence and defense posture, including the decision on to establish the enhanced forward presence, which is for us important, very important issue. The presence of the EFP battle groups in the region, first of all, and the foremost, increases our security in real terms. There is no doubt on that. Secondly, the most important is that it has a great political significance. It is a strong signal of the unity and coherence of the alliance. It demonstrates the strength of transatlantic bonds, and it is the security guarantee that attack on one ally will result with the strong response. And also this important thing that this step breaking Cold War divisions. We have first time in the history we have combat-ready troops from another allies on the territory of our countries. And this third it has also military significance, even that it was mentioned in the beginning, even that one might say that these battalion-size battle groups are on a relatively low tactical level and are without military significance vis-à-vis Russians' forces. Yeah, they are only battalion size, but they have military significance. NATO's, it's also important to say that NATO's EFP is defensive, proportionate and balanced answer to Russians' actions. It is also in line with international commitments, including the 1997 non-legally binding NATO-Russia Funding Act. It must be underlined. To us in Poland, it was obvious from the beginning that these temporary responses would have to grow into something more significant, permanent, stable. Poland, since our accession, has constantly advocated for the presence of NATO and alliance infrastructure on our territory. Needless to say that that is still our target, and it is connected also with EFP. We more than welcomed the NATO's and US bilateral commitments to strengthen security, not only in Poland, but in the region. Oh, I have 1 minute. So there is a strong and broad political and public support for both NATO's and US presence on the Polish territory. It is also a general expectancy that both NATO's and US presence will be developing to something more permanent, persistent. The question if should be a long-term or short-term. As I said, we aimed at persistent presence. And the EFP itself should be as long as can be, as the decision of the allies will be. But for sure, at that moment, the perception is that so far there is no signals that something might change for better. We assume that for next years Russia will maintain its aggressive stance and its foreign and security policy. And what we need now in Europe, we need more predictability, transparency, and confidence. As long as our threat perception. Oh, I have 0 minutes. I go to the end. The end of the EFP is definitely a long-term commitment for us, needed because of the territorial security situation at NATO eastern borders. Let me say that, what is important is a burden sharing, and Poland bears fair share of this effort, I think. Let me say that we are contributing to the Canadian-led group in Latvia. We are contributing also to the forces tailored forward presence in Romania. We prepared and offered to establish multinational division headquarters, which will be deployable and can be moved to the region. We also, together with Germany and Denmark, have taken concrete steps to develop capabilities of the multinational core in Stradiņš, which is dedicated to the region, and it's I stop. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Colonel. Thank you very much. And indeed, as you mentioned, Poland is unique because it's not only reassured, it not only hosts allies, but it also sends its troops here to Latvia, which is, I think, very, very much appreciated as a sign of solidarity. So thank you for that. But let's move on, and next speaker, Ambassador Kalev Stoicescu from Estonia. So you are assured by the British who are Brexiting. And others as well, but not as many as we have. But please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Māris, and thanks to the Institute for inviting me. First, let me say that the EFP is something we desired in Estonia all along, from the time we became members of NATO. And I would like to make a comment that these are not NATO troops that have arrived to our countries and that we're hosting, but these are troops of our NATO allies, because we are NATO as well. And this deterrent is composed by these battalions that are forward deployed to our countries and our own defense forces, which is an important matter, I think. And this is particularly welcome after a whole decade that ended in early 2014, where before that NATO's enlargement was rather political, I would say, and there was very little thinking and doing about collective defense, which was more declaratory rather than practical in these terms. So in terms of welcoming the EFP, that obviously goes for our government, the armed forces, but also Estonia's population in general, at least the vast majority of our population. We conduct regular independent opinion polls. The Ministry of Defense does it among the entire population in all corners of the country, and this support has been maintained. I will come back to it because there are some peculiarities, though, in this connection. I would like to say further that in addition to the desire to host Allied troops to feel more secure and better defended, one had to create certain conditions, practical conditions to that end. And I wouldn't like to say that these considerations were immediately understood in Estonia or many other countries for that matter, because collective defense, as I said, was not very popular before even 2008 or even after that, after the Georgia events. Nevertheless, we understood slowly the importance of host nation support, and we took it very seriously. For example, the renovation of the Ämari air base close to Tallinn. It was crucial for expanding the Baltic air policing mission, but also for receiving quickly support in a permissive environment. However, it took many years to negotiate that with our allies to use this state-of-the-art airbase, but it was still Mr. Putin who finally decided the use of the airbase in just a few days after the annexation of Crimea. We also understood, especially after Russia's war of aggression against Georgia, that the level of defense expenditures that we pledged to, that means at least 2% of our gross domestic product, has to be reached in order to be able to finance these efforts and to build the necessary infrastructure, which is now absolutely indispensable in hosting the British, French, and Danish battalion tactical group. And what to say, the deployment of the EFP contingents to the Baltic states and Poland is obviously based on the conditions and necessities imposed by our security environment that we have now, and as well as the Western-Russian relations in general. And I believe that these conditions are most likely and unfortunately not going to change in the foreseeable future, at least not as long as President Putin's regime is in power, or even if he is followed by someone with a quite similar CV, for that matter, and policy. So this is not a temporary measure, and we have to be ready to host these troops that we very much welcome, so for years to come. And we are particularly happy, and I hope that Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland as well, with the national contingents that we're hosting, because we have a history of very good cooperation in international operations and missions with the Brits, with the French, and with the Danes in Afghanistan, Iraq, in KFOR, etc., and with the French even in Africa, I would say, in Mali and the Central African Republic. And obviously the United States presence in the region is absolutely crucial, and the visibility of this presence, and this encourages us very much. Actually, I wrote a piece for the Finnish Institute of International Affairs on the transatlantic link, and to put it in broader terms, I think that this is a history of 100 years from where in April 1917 1 million US soldiers were deployed to Europe, and they were pulled up but then they remained after the Second World War so that they would never have to be deployed again to our defense. I will limit just one more comment. You gave me 60 seconds, thank you. That on the size of the EFP, I mean the land force component is for now minimal, but hopefully sufficient as a deterrent, because this is the very purpose of the VFP. But we also have to consider our own limited capabilities to host eventually additional troops if the environment deteriorates. But we need certainly some other capabilities, air and maritime capabilities for sure, as well as air and missile defense. And especially we have to keep a close look on the preparation and further conduct of the Zapad 2017 exercise in Belarus. And we are actually happy that the host country, Belarus, has taken an approach to openness. And in our own bilateral contacts, they have actually told us that they would very much like to see observers, which actually builds trust, we hope, in this situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Stoicescu. Thank you very much. And next we have Mr. Kažociņš, and it's difficult to quote somebody that is present, but I will remember one of your speeches or expressions. You told that prior to Ukraine, NATO was almost a rotten organization. So how do things look like now?
Well, thank you very much indeed. Before answering that, I want to say a couple of things about history, because as the battle group, Canadian-led battle group, is arriving in Latvia, we find that many of the journalists coming and talking to us about it have very scant understanding of our history and indeed of the tactical, operational and strategic concepts involved in the EFP. As far as Latvia is concerned, we regained our gained our independence initially in 1918, but it took us till 1921 to actually implement it, and that was done. And I'm sorry to contradict such a very serious senior diplomat as our Polish chargé d'affaires, but we had Polish forces on Latvian territory who, together with Estonian, French and British forces, helped us secure our independence, after which, in 1921, we signed a peace treaty with the Soviet Union. And then we thought, well, now we're neutral, we're safe. Well, and of course we weren't, because we were on our own. Even though Latvia spent 27% of the absolute budget on defense in 1938, it was not enough to keep us safe. Therefore, when we regained independence in 1991, we learnt from our history, and that's why joining NATO was such an incredibly important goal, which we're so pleased to reach. Why EFP? We've already heard about Georgia, the Crimea, Donbass, and exercise Zapad 17 has been mentioned several times. It is a very serious exercise. And here, if you have a capability to do something, it doesn't mean you have the intention of doing it. But if you don't have the capability, the intention's no use at all. If you have the capability, then the intention can change at the blink of an eyelid, particularly if there's only one person making the decision. That's why the enhanced forward presence is so important. And let us remember, over 20 of the 29 NATO nations involved. NATO works on consensus. If something really, really dramatic happened, if you've already got over 20 votes in the North Atlantic Council, that's a hell of a long way already. Next. What does it mean to Latvia? Well, it means, unlike in 1939-40, we're not on our own. Secondly, being a member of NATO matters. Unfortunately, Ukraine is not a member of NATO. Therefore, Ukraine is in a very different position. We have reliable allies who are prepared to come to help us. And our people really do appreciate that. Why is it important to NATO? Because NATO credibility is being tested. Let's not beat about the bush. That's what it's all about. And why is it important? Because they are the values and rules that have been mentioned before, which have kept the peace largely, at least in the West, since 1945. We must defend our core values of freedom, democracy, and the rule of law, otherwise they will be trampled over. And that means that any threat to any one ally is a threat and an attack on all of us, because that is what makes us strong, unity and solidarity. A question which we are sometimes asked, will NATO have to fight Russia? Well, the whole purpose of deterrence is to avoid conflict. Therefore, the EFP makes a NATO military confrontation with Russia much less likely. And here, I would like to just make a point about tripwires in response to Leo. As a military person, I know that tripping a tripwire will mean that a very big bang is going to go off and I will be killed. Therefore, I, as a soldier, am extremely motivated to make sure that I do not trip a tripwire. Perhaps it's the wrong terminology. We're talking about deterrence, and if it is something which is not understood in these terms, then we have to find different terms. But the whole point of it is to avoid a conflict. We have the dual approach, deterrence and dialogue. For Latvia, it is incredibly important because as much as we would like to and even have a referendum on it, we cannot change places with beautiful BC, British Columbia. And that would make us safe, but we are going to be here and Russia is going to be our neighbor for as long in the future as we exist. Therefore, we are interested in extremely good relations with our neighbor. What can we expect? Well, information warfare is the reality of 21st century media. Therefore, we will hear how awful our NATO reinforcing EFP soldiers are, that they're raping girls or minors left, right, and center. And by the way, they're all homosexual as well, and they're trying to and so on and so forth. The Latvian population doesn't want them here. Who would want all these horrible soldiers marching, trampling all over your country? Well, be prepared for it, because this will come out. We've seen it already. Social cohesion, that is a weakness. We realize that, and that is something we have to work with and to make sure that we cannot be justifiably accused of discrimination. No doubt there are other areas, but that means of the three ways of defending ourselves, resilience is at the top of the list. Next comes credible self-defense, which we are doing. Article 3 comes before Article 5. Article 3 says every country has the duty to defend itself. Third, Article 5, collective defense. That is where the deterrence and the tripwire effect, if you trip it, then all hell is going to break loose and the full force of NATO is going to hit you. How long do we want EFP here? Well, the official line is as long as it's necessary. In reality, we want that necessity to be as short as possible, because our aim is to live next to a Russia which is stable, predictable, democratic, and friendly. Thank you very much.
Many thanks. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kažociņš. And next we have the representative from Canada, of course not representing the government of Canada, but Professor Leuprecht. So recently I watched news on CTV News in Canada. So in the first question that you were asked with your participation, so you were asked, could Russia see this as an act of provocation? So is this the only question being asked in Canada, or and what is the situation there, how you see situation from the other shore of the ocean? So welcome.
So, look, I think part of the challenge is, of course, that Canada is very far away from this part of the world. And one of the challenges is trying to explain this mission to Canadians. And so I hope in the same way I'm able to articulate today why Canada would be one of the countries that would stand up as a framework country. I myself I grew up in Munich, so I have some sensitivity towards what it means to grow up less than 100 kilometers from the Iron Curtain. And I also remember sort of as a kid playing a little video game where one of the cities with which you traded was Riga. And so it reminds, of course, of the Hanse and the long-standing trading relationship and collaboration that really long precedes sort of the current arrangements that we have in terms of collaboration. So I teach at the Royal Military College of Canada, the only fully federally funded university in the country, in our service academy. And if you go to our senior staff mess, we have pictures of both Generals Wolfe and Montcalm on the wall, the two generals on the plains of Abraham, 1759, led the French and the English troops. And I always, when international delegations come through, show them this, because one of the things that we've learned in Canada is that it's important not to pick sides in these efforts, but rather that this is always a collaborative effort. And if you look at a country such as Canada, I mean, really it shouldn't exist as a country, given its diversity, its geography, the many sort of elements that divide the country, and yet it is one of the oldest democracies and one of the oldest federations in the world. And so Canada has learned a lot and has a lot, I think, to contribute to the world about how we move forward collectively rather than in division. So if we look at sort of some of the neighborhood here, I mean, one of the concerns, I mean, as we've heard from the Swedes, I mean, the Swedes are even remilitarizing Gotland, an island that they had militarily essentially completely abandoned. They're remilitarizing it at great expense because they have to buy back all the property that they previously sold off. We have the precedent here, I think, in the neighbor of the Baltic Defense College that reminds us not only of the multinational countries in which we are in, but also the multinational cooperative effort here in the region that I think can be a real signal also for NATO. Canada has a long-standing involvement with NATO's Center of Excellence for Strategic Communications, and of course was the first country to recognize Latvian independence after 1991, and has long played a role in the air assurance, the air defense mission. So why would Canada do this? I mean, there's three mission sets for the Canadian Armed Forces: defend the country, defend the continent, and collective defense. I'm always a little hesitant to talk about deterrence because there's a great empirical debate about whether deterrence actually works. But I think the concept of reassurance is much more helpful. My father worked for Munich Re, which is the largest reinsurance company in the world. And what reinsurance is about distributing risk, so that if you have a major casualty, no one company goes bankrupt. And I think the reassurance mission is about making sure that no one country in NATO goes bankrupt in terms of the way that you distribute the risks. So not just bankrupt, obviously, in financial terms, but bankrupt in terms of their sovereignty. And to this effect, I mean, what NATO is about is ultimately for each member country, as was pointed out, these are not NATO troops, these are member country troops. There's cash, there's capabilities, and there's contribution. And so there's lots of talk about 2%, but really, I mean, okay, so Estonia and Greece both spend 2%, but arguably Canada in capabilities is able to deliver a lot more than some of the NATO member countries that do spend 2%. And so what this is really is about is, do you have the capabilities, and are you willing to commit those capabilities for the purpose of collective defense? And I think on that, none of us need to take lessons from the Americans, who overspend relative to their revenue by 3% every year. So when the Americans get their own budgets in order, then they can come and lecture everyone else about how much they should spend on defense. Canada is the 6th largest spender within NATO, and one of the advantages as NATO will always have is we'll always outspend the Russians. In fact, NATO spends about 75% of the world's defense expenditures. The problem with that is, as the Russians then ratchet up their defense expenditures, every dollar that we in our country spend on defense is money that is not there for economic development, for prosperity, for harmony, for social programs. And then one of the challenges that we see is, as countries ramp up defense spending, and they're in difficult economic situations, that inherently also has the risk of creating political and social instability. So why are we here? In terms of, we're active on the domain denial area, so air, sea, cyber, and of course now land. Why land? Because of what NATO calls the little green men. And this is important to remember, because we always pretend that these 50 to 70,000 Russian troops over there, their somehow invasion poses the greatest threat. The greatest threat is not an actual invasion. The greatest threat is the little green men without any national patches on their uniforms, that wander across borders and create all sorts of instability. And that's ultimately why we're trying to make sure that we have this enhanced forward mission. So this is not about a speed bump for thousands of Russian troops. I think it's also not really about a tripwire, because we don't want things to go boom. Rather, we want to make sure that we can prevent instability as we have seen it elsewhere in the world. What is this then? So NATO in that sense is, in the 21st century, brings to bear a well-honed concept of international and transnational governance when it comes to security and defense, to challenges that are ultimately transnational flows and movements that we want to deter. And so in that sense, NATO is also an important precedent in terms of how we cope with these transnational challenges from a sovereign-based international governance mechanism. The Europeans, of course, have long liked to fight their wars right down to the last Canadian, and so in that sense, Canada has learned that it rather would not be part of that actual fight. Canada's most important peacekeeping operation, of course, was its deployment to Germany during the Cold War. And so I think this is ultimately what we are modeling this on. So what are we seeing here? We never want to let a good crisis go to waste. Why are we here in terms of a NATO deployment? Because NATO, on the one hand, is a military alliance. And so, as you know, the Americans like to joke that NATO stands for needs Americans to operate. But of course, NATO is about a lot more than just a military alliance. It's also about overcoming collective action problems. And when we don't have a mechanism to overcome collective action problems, we see, so I'm spending a lot of time in Australia these days, and one of the challenges the Australians have is there is no such mechanism as NATO or sort of collective defense institutions. And so then what you get is what, as Leo Michel pointed out, we deploy massive amounts of military resources into the region. And so part of what NATO can help us do is actually help to avoid having to deploy all these military resources. So if we, in terms of overcoming collective action problems, what's NATO about? Traditionally about keeping the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. And this has always been what the concern is about. For the Americans, it's been about making sure that the other allies continue not to have a race to the bottom and spend enough and contribute enough. And for the allies, it's been about making sure that the Americans stay within this coalition. What we have here in terms of the framework countries, notice that 3 of them are federations and the 4th is ultimately a multinational country. These are all countries that understand that it is important for governance and security purposes to move forward together and to reconcile different types of interests. Notice that Germany, of course, now, from the keeping the Germans down piece, is part of this NATO framework country leadership. Now, why would the Americans, the Canadians, the Germans step up in the Baltic countries? Because any risk and any threat to territorial integrity in the Baltic countries is an existential threat to the United States, to Canada, and to Germany, as well as to the other allies. And this is where national interests and collective defense interests converge here. There's been lots of talk about US offshore balancing, the US retrenching some of its assets back to the United States. But of course, not everything in terms of the criticism that we've heard from the current administration is entirely out of line. The European allies pulled 50 billion euros out of defense in the early 2000s. And so there is perhaps some rebalancing that needs to be done here. What makes this mission different from other missions is that I would say from a US perspective currently, things such as climate change or even cyber attacks do not constitute an existential threat in terms of a US perspective for this particular region. But territorial integrity and any sort of instability in this region does constitute this existential threat. So we want to make sure that the United States stays engaged. And this has always been an important component of Canada's contribution to NATO, because we want the Americans to play, then we need to play as well. And this is why Canada is stepping up. What's the strategy behind this? So in 1938, Canada and the United States got together at what is known as the Ogdensburg Declaration and basically decided that it was in their interest to keep the world's problems and the world's threats away from Canada's shores. And this is then translated into the Kingston Dispensation in 1940, and I think it explains why arguably North America is such a prosperous and relatively harmonious continent relative to so many other places in the world. And what Canada is doing and the United States is doing is translating that same strategy to Europe. That is in Canada's interest to make sure we keep the problems of the world away from European shores. This is why Canada is currently flying air denial missions and air defense missions over Iceland, why we have ships in the Mediterranean, why we have special forces in Iraq, why we're engaged in the cyber mission and ramping that up considerably with regards to the defense policy review. And by the way, this is why the deployment here took longer than originally anticipated, because securing the cyber networks, this is where we expect to have the first intervention from our adversary in terms of compromising our cyber capabilities and exploiting those, and we want to make sure all those are in place. And of course, now what we have is the land mission in Latvia. This is going to be a popular mission with Canadians because in many ways it's a very pleasant country to be, but it's also going to be popular because it gives Canada not only a kinetic component in terms of its deployment, but as the ambassador already alluded to, a leadership component. And Canada has always punched above its weight because of that leadership experience, especially for mid-level and sort of junior, senior ranking officers, to be able to come out and we can then deploy that experience, whether that's in Latvia, whether that's in other parts of the world. And this is why as a medium-sized country, Canada can then harness and leverage its interests and control the means and the ends of these types of collective missions.
Christian.
Why is my last remark? So why are we here? Because Europe is not in crisis. Europe is an emerging superpower. And what we expect from superpowers is precisely that we call on them to deal with the world's crisis, both internally and externally. And so this is why Canada contributes to EU stability operations. This is why Canada is present in Latvia. And I want to just sort of close with this particular remark that one of the problems that we have is we have started to take democracy for granted, and democracy is something that remains to be defended.
Thank you, Christian. So we started the input statements with Poland, and last but not least is Russia. So Russia has been mentioned many times today, maybe even more frequently than NATO. So Mr. Zulkharneev, so you have the opportunity to explain how the situation looks like from Moscow. So please.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for the invitation. It's my first visit to Riga. Yesterday I enjoyed the city and I walked around. I heard Latvian speech, Russian speech, a lot, German, English. And suddenly I began thinking about why I'm here to discuss EFP and Russian reaction to these plans and practical steps, and not to discuss such a great potential that our countries have if we are in good neighbor relations. And the other point probably is the whole discussion is about deterrence of the threat which from our position does not exist. I don't realize why should Russia attack Baltic countries or Poland? What's any kind of reason or rationale? I don't see this, and probably I think that most of the Russian political, not most, but all of them, I have never heard something from very marginal Russian politicians who can doubt integrity or independence and sovereignty of these countries and our neighbors. So, but we discuss what we discuss. I do represent only myself, but I try to make such a generalized view from Russian position. But there are different Russian positions. There are conservative, liberals, patriots, and so on. Certainly just generalized view. How do Russian political elite and military perceive this NATO AFP and other military plans? 4 points. First, all the decisions and practical steps demonstrate that Russia is not considered anymore as a partner of NATO, but as a real and potential enemy that has to be deterred and against whom military capacity should be built up. This is a fundamental change. From a military point of view, if we speak about these 4 battle groups, certainly they are not threats, and they are not considered as a threat. But they are important indication of fundamental change that brings us back for a quarter century back. It's a sign of military pressure on the Russian borders, an attempt to build relations with Russia from a position of strength. But if EFP is should be considered in a broader context of other NATO steps, including NATO enlargement, development of NATO infrastructure in the neighboring countries, development of infrastructure that allow and create capabilities for significant increase of real forces, creation of very high readiness joint task force within response force, development of NATO military infrastructure in the Arctic region in Norway, in northern Norway, new military infrastructure, new missions of air patrols over Baltic, and the issue and initiatives of preventing incidents in the air and in the sea in Baltic are also ignored and neglected. So all these actions are interpreted in Moscow as NATO pursue its own interests by means of force. Russian diplomats and military are very disappointed, especially with the fact that so much was done, so many investments were done to change the Cold War logic of our relations, and finally we are back for many years. But if NATO imposes such a confrontational logic, Russia has to react accordingly and will do it. The second point, development of infrastructure and development of new forces means it's not just a temporary step, just Waldemar confirmed the same. It's something that defines the logic of the confrontation and the logic of the relations for future. These long-term investments require political and ideological justification. Confrontational military planning also require confrontational rhetoric. So we are at risk to be absorbed by the logic of a Cold War for a long period. But in the but in the Cold War, it was a real enemy. And now there is no any real reason to build our relations on this confrontational logic. The third point, new areas of military risk. Central Europe, Poland, Baltic countries, Baltic region, Northern Europe were free of any military risks and threats for more than 25 years. What is the reason for these countries to come back and again take a role of a potential battlefield? All of us were free of these concerns and fears, and now they are back. The fourth point, militarization of Europe, military spending and military expenditures. Instead of negotiations on limitation of military spending, we see a call to increase military expenditures to up to 2% of GDP. If NATO countries do it, it means that these countries will spend enormous money for military equipment, for new weapons, probably mainly produced by the American companies. And it again was confirmed here today. What does it mean? It means militarization of Europe, while there is no real military threat. When there is no real threat, but you need to increase military spending, you create an image of an enemy. And who is the best candidate? Russia. It's a problem for Russia. It's a problem for Baltic countries, Poland, and other Eastern European countries. But the most important problem is that real threats are neglected. Terrorism and instability in the southern flank of Europe. It's necessary to cooperate and cooperate with Russia on these issues. But artificial political limitations are posed, and they just close this way for real and important cooperation. The fifth point, stagnation and arms control both in Europe and globally. In the existing environment, when Russia transformed from NATO partner to NATO's enemy, the modernization of Vienna document, creation and development of other arms control mechanisms in Europe certainly are unlikely to be in the interest of Russian politicians and Russian political leaders. I would like to pay attention also to the global dimension of these issues. It used to be that strategic nuclear relations were part of a matter of Russian-American relations or Soviet-American relations. But now, when Central European countries allow deployment of the elements of strategic forces, I mean missile defense systems, on their territories, it means they share responsibility for future of global security. From Russian point of view, deployment of missile defense elements in Poland and Romania is a threat to Russian security and vital threat to Russian nuclear arsenals and nuclear deterrence. Nuclear deterrence with the United States. It also, by the way, is a threat to INF, International Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty. So again, the countries of the region make themselves a potential targets, and it's not Russian will. These are dangerous games without any rationale. Nothing in current European security contradictions costs a risk of missile or nuclear arms race in Europe. What are the reasons from Moscow perspective? First, and in general, a key problem is a failure to create common European space, common European security space and security system. I'd like to say that Ukraine is not the reason, it's not the cause, it's the first, or not the first, it's the result of this failure to create this common European security system. The situation in Ukraine began not in Donbass. The situation, the Ukrainian tragedy, and this terrible situation began with Eastern Partnership, with the aspiration to artificially divide people in Ukraine into those who are for Russia or for Europe, which is very artificial and non-useful division, and with these factors. The same we see now in Moldova. Just recently, more than 50% of population in Moldova voted for the president who is in favor or favors development of relations with Russia. Why do we need to impose again the same agenda that was imposed to Ukraine, to Moldova? At least in this small region, in this small country, it's necessary to start real dialogue on harmonization of economic, political, and security interests. The second point is inertia. The second reason is the inertia of the Cold War mentality, but I thought about this. The third is this fake enemy in the East is a justification for NATO bureaucracy and more for military-industrial complex. NATO, as a bureaucratic machine, as a military machine, needs a target, needs a problem. And unfortunately, it tailored not for terrorism and struggling with terrorism. It is tailored for struggling with enemies like Russia, and again, it's a fake enemy as Russia. 1 minute. So, what countermeasures Russia has taken and could take and will take? First, it's a strengthening of Russia's defense capability in the Russian western borders. You know about this, it's formation of new military units and forces in the western and southern military districts, military exercises, and you know about this. But at the same time, we should say that they are rather transparent, it was said. And when Belarus suggested transparency, be sure they are doing this in coordination with Russia, not just because of joint trainings. But what I'd like to stress is that Russia is open for resuming dialogue. Just recently, in the Moscow Conference on International Security, General Shoigu, Russian Minister of Defense, just said the same, referring to NATO-Russia Founding Act. We need to resume this dialogue on this basis, that Russia and NATO no longer regard each other as adversaries, and that their goal is to overcome the remnants of their farming, confrontation, and rivalry. The ball is in NATO's court. So finally, I'd like to say that my personal remark that there is now a new generation of people who are 25 years old, more or less, and certainly we know that we have some difficult historical legacy. But while a new generation is not indoctrinated with this historical legacy, we have a chance to change the logic of the relations in Eastern Europe and be motivated not by old fears, but by new opportunities. We see that relations between Russia, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland are critical for European security and for global security. And I would just suggest to think about initiating some professional dialogue on these contradictions with involvement of new generation of people. Thank you.
So, while questions are prepared, let me ask you one question. So you said before your speech that there are many views in Russia, conservative, liberal, patriotic, but you will provide yours. Which was yours?
No, but because my task from you was to express some visions of Europe, and I had opportunities to discuss with military, with Russian military, with Russian diplomats and politicians. I tried to summarize this mainstream view among those who are working with Russian military or foreign policy agenda. But my view is that these are rather bit different situations, and usually refer to the situation in Ukraine, but it's not. But to translate and to make parallels with situation in Ukraine and with situation in the Baltic region is very different. And so I would not make such conclusions that it can happen somewhere else. Because it's, and if you compare all the situations, Abkhazia, Ossetia, Georgia, Ukraine, they are different in this.
Okay.
They're different.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have some 11 minutes for questions and answers, and then all the speakers will be able to respond in one shot. So are there questions here or maybe online? If anybody is watching us and having questions, it's possible to ask us on Twitter. So do I see any hand raised? No questions? How can it be? Were all the questions asked already in the very beginning? So if not, then I will have to ask some questions instead of... no, there is. I'm sorry, didn't see. So, Toms.
Thank you. There's been a lot of talk about increasing defense spending and committing to increasing a number of troops and a number of air carriers, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the issues that has also been brought up is that in this 21st century, cyber attacks are real and cyber enemies are a reality. There have been allegations of cyber attacks from Russia specifically in both the American election and apparently somebody mentioned in the French election, which I was not made aware of before. So I'm curious as to how much of the defense spending does NATO intend to put towards defending against those cyber attacks and these types of enemies, if any?
Thank you very much for the question. Any other questions? The last opportunity. And there's Toms, Mr. Lynch, the member of the parliament.
Seems that the military situation is quite clear, okay? But the question is, following up to what the lady said here, that we know of Russia's cyber attacks in Washington, very successful, by the way. France, not so successful. Now we just heard 2 days ago that Germany is building up a firewall against Russian attempts to influence the German elections this year. Now, probably this is a question, maybe to all, but especially to Mr. General Kažociņš. What about the Baltic states? How can we build a firewall? We have elections too, you know, next year in October. And in Sweden, by the way, in Sweden it's September next year, in Latvia it's in October. How good are we at building up these firewalls? I thought, let me just say one comment. I think we're pretty good because what happened in America would never happen here because we expect it all the time. The Americans didn't expect it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Lynch. There was one question. Please.
Thank you. I have a question to our Russian colleague. Perhaps two parts. The first is about, you hardly mentioned Ukraine, which of course it only came sort of at the end and sort of as a side note to all of this. But you said, well, Ukraine, it didn't start in Donbass. It all started with the Eastern Partnership, I think you said. So the EU association agreement with Ukraine and everything related to that. So isn't that a sovereign choice for the Ukrainian people to make, which kind of relations they want? Basically, as far as I know, it's enshrined in the Helsinki Accords of the 70s, which even signed by the Soviet Union at the time, which states that independent states can set their own foreign and security policy. And that's a fundamental principle of international politics. I think that's at the root of the problem we have now with Russia. And the second, related to the Zapad exercise, there are reports suggesting that, and I think that's a concern, particularly in this region, that some of the Russian forces that may go to Belarus as part of the exercise may never leave Belarus again, may stay behind for a longer period of time. Do you have any indications about that? Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So the very last question, who wants the microphone? And then it's switched off immediately. So, is there? In the back. Yeah.
Thank you. Ben Heap from the NATO Stratcom Centre of Excellence. I'm looking forward over the next 2-3 years. What do you see as the key vulnerability to the cohesion and unity in terms of the consensus across the 29 nations to sustain enhanced forward presence as a mission in the future? The key vulnerability to that consensus. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Heap. Thank you all for the questions. So we have exactly 6 minutes for some answers, and may I propose that we start in the reverse order and start with Mr. Zulkharneev to address the questions that were asked, and also maybe if other speakers want to respond to something that was said previously. So please, Mr. Zulkharneev.
First, about cyber attacks. It's also strange, like with this idea of deterrence, but it's in the western part, in America, and here it's so obvious that it was Russian and Russian. In Russian, there was no such understanding. Why you think that in Germany, not rivalries of the Madam Chancellor, but Russia will do this? There's no now technical means, there is no technical tool to identify who is in charge of this attack. It could be, but I just repeat, but I can send you some, our center is working on this. It's impossible to identify who was it. And it could be used by anybody. And certainly Russia could be pointed as such entity accused of. About European partnership, certainly I agree with you completely. It's about sovereign right and about everything. It's not about, and in itself it's not bad, it's okay, but it became a pretext for internal Russian conflict and division of population. It's not about Russia, it's not about NATO. It's about this situation when something is imposed. And if we talk about Russia, Russia has its own also economic and security and political interests. And what do we mean when we speak about harmonization of interests? It's necessary to discuss all these issues. I would compare it with another situation. I didn't have time and I did not pronounce this thesis. If we compare western part of Eurasia with eastern part of Eurasia, with China and with Central Asian republics, certainly at this region we had a lot of problems. But what we did, we managed to overcome these problems. Within Shanghai Cooperation Organization, we had very active political interactions, and we tried to harmonize political and economic relations without depriving of any sovereign interest and without depriving sovereignty of any Central Asian country, without depriving sovereignty of China or Russia. There are modes to harmonize interests and to create common European common security spaces without depriving sovereignty of countries.
Would you like to address the questions that were raised, or tell anything more that you wanted, or respond to some comments in 1 minute?
So on the cyber thing, I mean, this is part of function, I think, of grand strategy, right? So we associate the more you spend on defense, that this is somehow better grand strategy, and somehow the less you spend, that's somehow worse grand strategy. But of course, as Paul Kennedy has famously pointed out, grand strategy is about protecting social harmony, economic prosperity, our ability to live together and to provide adequate services for our citizens. And that's ultimately what the cyber domain is about, because it risks undermining all of those capabilities. And so it's less about spending than about the actual capabilities. Look, North Korea can bring to bear, as a small country, fantastic cyber capabilities. It's a highly asymmetric threat, and what we're all struggling with is how do we counter that particular threat? And so I think there's a security dimension to that, there's a defense dimension to that, and there's an offense dimension to that, because the common assumption among military planners is that the next serious war is going to be a cyber war, and so how do we actually engage in deterrence in the cyberspace so we don't enter into that war? To that effect, I think we need to get out of the mindset of firewalls. We've all traveled through Europe. There's lots of nice castles around Europe. There's a reason we don't have city walls and gates that we shut at night anymore, because that's not a particularly good way of defending our cities. What cyber is ultimately about, it's about countering network threats, it's about information security operations, and it's about offensive measures in an ability to reassure and to deter those individuals who want to engage in that. So I think we have to be very careful about the analogies that we use in that particular space.
Thank you very much. General Kažociņš.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just another word on cyber. I hope that if there is a German firewall, they don't call it the Siegfried line, or if they do, that it'll be more effective than the Maginot line. Jokes aside, I absolutely agree. In the modern world, cyber is not a military issue. It's not military spending, and we're talking more about defense in depth, having redundancy, having different ways of doing things and bypassing problems. Next, Russia and defense. Russia began its militarization program, as I'm sure you know very well, from 2008, and there's a very specific plan what to achieve by 2020. And this was at a time when NATO certainly was not increasing its defense spending. In the security doctrine, which President Putin signed in December 2015, the US and implicitly NATO is called a threat. And the exercises Zapad 2009-2013 were intimidating, particularly if you are a resident of Warsaw, because in 2009 it ended with a mock de-escalating nuclear strike on Warsaw. I mean, that's very frightening. Spheres of influence, that is something which comes through Russian foreign policy all the time. And let me remind us all that between the eastern border of NATO-EU and the western border of the Russian Federation, there are 81.2 million people. Some of them may well want to have much closer ties to Russia than they do to the European Union. But each of those countries, in the 6 countries, should have the option of deciding which way to go. Finally, consensus, what is the key vulnerability against our consensus? Well, that's it. It is, again, the vulnerability is our consensus. And why is it vulnerable? Because we have lost, in the West, we have lost our link to our values. Democracy versus globalization, it's been called. If we don't find another way of re-establishing this link, we are in grave danger. And if we add to that the fact that people in the West generally have no idea what war means, it's something you see in movies, it doesn't happen, or on the television, it doesn't happen in the West. There is a small warrior class who go and risk their lives, but for the ordinary man and woman in the street, it's not there. Well, it damn well can be, and it can happen very suddenly, because after 100 years of peace, from 1815 to 1914, nobody in the West thought that a big European war was possible, and yet we blundered into it, and the consequences were horrific.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stoicescu.
Thank you. I have 5 very short comments. One,
in
first,
60
cyber.
seconds.
This is part of Russia's hybrid warfare and has to be understood, part of this strategy. And it's not oriented only towards the, so to say, frontline countries like ours, as it was understood in 2007. Well, Estonia was cyber attacked, probably not by Martians, or by Finns or Latvians, I suppose. And now, after the interference in Western elections, it is absolutely clear that we're all under attack. So that is point 1. Point 2, question about the vulnerability in 2-3 years term regarding the commitment to the EFP and solidarity and all this. I think this is the question whether Russia is still considered then to be a real potential threat or not. This is the basic question, and we have an agreement on that, and that's why at 28 or 29 we agreed to have these measures being taken. What regards President Putin and his regime, this is my personal opinion, they have lost all credibility, even if we reach some agreements with him, the credibility about keeping these agreements is very much in doubt. Third question, your remark, Albert, is that NATO needs an enemy. No, it doesn't. NATO was attacked by terrorists. Remember 9/11, we took action against terrorism. If we see a Russia threat, we take action to defend ourselves. And please remember that NATO is a defensive, and I stress defensive organization, and whatever we do is defensive. And this leads me to the fourth point, which is transparency. Everything we do is utmost transparent, done in small steps, very wisely, not to give Russia any reason to suspect that we don't have any Barbarossa plans. We only have contingency plans for self-defense, right? Whatever the Russian media would say that Estonians and Brits and French are preparing to conquer St. Petersburg. No, we're not. This is pure lies. And this is absolutely exaggerated. I am sure that the Russians actually, and your military, feel very confident about that we are not really planning to do such thing. And if we speak about your comment that Belarus will have to coordinate with Russia the question of observers for Zapad 2017, the word coordination may be interpreted in many ways, I suppose. But I suppose that Belarus is an independent and sovereign country, and if this exercise takes place on its territory, then they are the first ones to ask observers on their own territory, even if this is a bilateral exercise. And the last is about militarization. Well, Russia spends a little bit more than one third of its state budget on the military, on internal security. This is the level that countries do when they are in a real war, basically. And they spend not tens of percents, but Russia spends about 10 times less on education and health sector compared to NATO countries like ours and so on. I believe the future is in educated and healthy people, but our neighbor spends it in tanks and Iskander systems, etc., etc. So if we would see in Russia a different tendency not to arm itself to its teeth and threaten neighbors, but when the accent is put differently, then perhaps we will have much more confidence, to be frank.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Stoicescu. And last but not least, Colonel.
I'm military, don't worry. I'd like to point out one thing. We are going, I think we are running in the cycle. There is the question who is the first and who responds to the threat. We need the dialogue with Russia. It's without questions, but not in the expense of defense and deterrence posture first. We have a dual track and we should keep this solution. What I don't agree with my colleague that you said that we neglected all initiatives of Russia. I think it's not the true. I have on my desk, I know this political strategic question, but on the military level, Russia neglected all cooperation, and Vienna document is blocked for 2 years, modernization. It's not ready for openness. And as I said, we are ready to take a structured dialogue already started in Vienna. So something is going on. But the most important thing is that if Russia goes with initiatives, it must be goes also with the assurance that it's without preconditions, and it take all discussions. It will take security interest all countries. That's what I have.
Thank you, Colonel. Thank you.
I didn't answer the question about Zapad
10 seconds.
2007. As I know, this information was disproved. There's no confirmation of this information.
Good. So we will be able to continue the discussions a bit later in more informal environment. May I ask now Mr. Sprūts with some concluding remarks to conclude, and as he is moving forward, please join me in a round of applause to our panelists for these many points.
Thank you, Māris. Thank you to the speakers. I think it has been very timely debate today because of some celebratory mood of inauguration of deployments, enhanced forward presence deployments here in Riga next Monday. But of course, it's not just only about this moment in time. I think it's more fundamental debate. What is about the NATO, where the NATO goes, what about security in the region, what about our relationship with Russia? And I think this debate today was trying to provide the answers, and I believe it was quite a comprehensive overview analysis of different aspects, different dimensions of these fundamental issues. Everybody can draw their own conclusions. I think there is a lot of sources of different ideas and perspectives. My own, just very shortly in a nutshell, and follow what Jānis Kažociņš said. NATO is, or NATO's credibility is being tested at the moment. It's being tested from outside, but the responses to those tests are actually found within the NATO itself. And you can find it on two levels, on multinational level and also on domestic or national level. On multinational level, we exactly see the moving forward, we see the progress, we see the deployments, we see the solidarity, we see the 20 countries out of 29 countries are willing to reassure and willing to participate in this multinational effort. On national level, which I think is very important to underline, and third article was mentioned here, and I think it is very important to mention third article because we're sometimes over-focused on fifth article. It's very important, but of course also there are some other articles as well. And third article, I would a little bit paraphrase. There is obligation to defend themselves. I would paraphrase saying there is obligation to be able to defend themselves, which means that you need to contribute, that you need to think about social cohesion within the country. You need to be societally resilient as well. So it's a wider issue on a national level. On Russia, very shortly. Just a day ago in a conference on Russia and NATO in Germany. And I like this one idea. Russia is a partner. Complicated one. You might say also with elements of challenge, but I think it's important to name it and to call it as a partner because it gives a signal. Let's see if we have extremely good relations in the near future, most likely not, and there will be those strategic challenges. But I think this partnership, and as being able to frame the partnership, it also shows that we are signaling we're trying to look for some sort of convergence of opinions as well, even though we saw that there are quite a divergence as well. So with this, I am happy to conclude my concluding remarks, and I can still additionally say thanks to the all involved in this event. I think it was a very successful and dynamic event. To the audience, which came in such a large numbers, to the speakers who absolutely gave different perspectives, and I think it was very important to have those comprehensive views. To the moderators, and I would underline the role of Māris, because one role, and I think it was a minor role who was playing the moderator in a public role, but Māris was really driving force putting all these things together. Of course, it's a real appreciation to Māris for this. And to our institutional partners. I will start with the president, with the presidential office as well. Jānis Kažociņš here is a representative of presidential office. The two embassies, Canadian embassy and Polish embassy, the NATO public diplomacy department, and also Konrad Adenauer, Stiftung Konrad Adenauer Foundation. With this, I am happy to give the floor to Elisabeth Bauer, who is the head of the Baltic and Nordic office of Konrad Adenauer Stiftung here in the region. So please, the floor is yours for concluding remarks.
Thank you. Some of the things you already summarized before in the first concluding remarks, so I don't want to take too much time out of you. Thanks for coming today over here, and I think we all could follow this interesting, informative, and really active discussion. What it shows as well is that NATO is not, especially in times of challenges and a bit of a feeling of unsecure or uncertainties in political spheres, foreign and security policy, and especially security policy in NATO, is a very important part of our work. And it is shown that NATO is a cornerstone for all member states, and especially as well, we have to point out for those who are next to us as Sweden and Finland, because they are sharing the same values. Second point, which was shown, we have to discuss much more about European defense policy. So there's still a need for discuss on that, to give the unclarities or something like that, to make it more clear what is meant by that, to point that out. And third, I would like to point out something as a representative of a political education center and a think tank. It was very good to point out that NATO is standing for freedom, democracy, and rule of law. Those are our values where we are looking for. And secondly, which is much more important, democracy has to be defended. I think that's one of the things we are looking for. Last but not least, from my side, thanks to all the moderators and lecturers, and especially to Andres Brutz, who organized all this with his team. Thanks a lot. A big applaud for all of them. Now we close the official part, and you are invited to have unofficial, informal talks over here. Thanks a lot.